Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. My name is Sandy Mayo, and I'm the VP for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at SPU. And this is our inaugural welcome to our inaugural diversity lecture. The intent is really to create community rhythms for us to continue to learn together and engage in conversations around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is work that we're doing every day here on this campus, but it's nice to be able to pause and to bring in thought leaders who can really challenge us, help us to grow and reflect on what we're currently doing and how we might move this work forward. And I can't think of a better way to start than with Jemar Tisby. So it's just been a real pleasure to get to know him today. I'll introduce him in a moment. But I just want to set the stage a little bit for this evening. It's going to go quickly. We'll have about 45 minutes to hear from Jemar, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And we're going to ask that you text your questions. We'll have a slide with instructions to do so, but you'll have a chance to text those in. We'll read them to Jemar and get through as many as we can. And then I know everyone's going to want to talk to him afterwards, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I'm going to need to take him to transition to our next event, so we're going to have a hard stop at 6:15. But I hope that you will really enjoy this time to engage with him around his book. Many of you have read. Some of you haven't. I would encourage you to do so. There's a lot that I want to say about Jemar. He's been on our campus all day today. I told him it should have been a week. His engagement with our students has been remarkable. He's been an encourager, and I think he should probably be on payroll, the amount of work he's done already today. So we've really enjoyed our time with him. But I'm going to stick to the script so I don't take up any more of his time, and just share a short bio for those who are not as familiar with his work. Jemar Tisby is the president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective, where he writes about race, religion, politics, and culture. He is also the co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast. He speaks at conferences nationwide and has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and CNN. He is also a PhD candidate in history at the University of Mississippi, focusing on race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. Without further ado, here's Jemar.
Hello? There we go. It was September 15th, 1963. It was the day of the Youth Day Sunday service at 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. And four little girls, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley, were putting final touches on their white dresses, getting ready to lead the service that morning in front of beaming parents and grandparents and church members. And they were making the final adjustments on their white dresses when the bomb exploded. It left a hole in the floor 5 feet wide and 2 feet deep. Killed all four girls. It decapitated poor Cynthia. Her parents could only tell it was their little girl by the shoes she was wearing and the ring left on her finger. In the aftermath of this tragedy, this act of racial terrorism, of course, people were outraged, not just in Alabama, but nationally and even internationally. How could such a thing happen? What a tragedy. How horrific. In the wake of it, there was a white lawyer named Charles Morgan Jr. He had been scheduled to give a talk in front of a young men's business group in Alabama. He went on with his talk, but he changed the content a little bit. As he spoke to his audience of all white businessmen in Birmingham, Alabama, he asked them a question. Who threw that bomb? Was it a Negro or a white? He answered the question for them, and he said, the answer is all of us. All of us did it. The who is every little individual who talks about the niggers and spreads the seeds of his hate to his neighbor and his son. The jokester, the crude oaf whose racial jokes rock the party with laughter. Then Charles Morgan Jr. turned his attention to the church, to Christians. And he said they had a role to play too. He asked his audience, did those ministers visit the families of the Negroes in their hour of travail? Did many of them go to the homes of their brothers and express their regrets in person or pray with the crying relatives? Do they admit Negroes into the ranks of their church? What Charles Morgan Jr. was getting at is the idea of complicity. You see, it's not that every single person or every single Christian was out there planting dynamite at churches. There were plenty of those folks, too many of those folks. But the great majority of Christians, particularly white Christians, weren't the ones physically planting the bombs, but they created a context where it could happen. You see, Birmingham had already had multiple bombings before. There was a place in Birmingham already labeled Dynamite Hill, and a nickname for the city was Bombingham. This wasn't the first time. And Charles Morgan Jr.'s questions loom over that audience, both past and present. When these tragedies occurred, when racism happened, what did you do? Did you speak up? Did you speak out? Or were you silent? Were you passive? Were you apathetic in the face of injustice? The truth is that the most egregious acts of racism, like a church bombing, can only happen within a context of compromise. So, as we get into this discussion this evening, one of the questions that I'm surprised I don't get asked more often, given the title of the book, The Color of Compromise, is just exactly what is the color of compromise? Is it pink or purple or fuchsia? Is anyone wearing fuchsia tonight? I don't know what it looks like. I've heard it's a color. So exactly what is the color of compromise? That's what we're going to talk about this evening. And what I'd like to propose to you is that the color of compromise is at least three colors. The first is green, which stands for the greed of slave traders and slave owners and all those who benefited from the economic exploitation of black bodies. The other color is white, for white supremacy. White supremacy, which told a story or a narrative of racial difference, which put white people on top or at the center, and people of color, particularly black people, on the margins and the edge. And lastly, the color of compromise is red. Red for the blood that flowed in support of the greed and the supremacy. Red for the violence that was always a necessary corollary to this hatred. The color of compromise is green. The color of compromise is white. The color of compromise is red. Before we go further, since I won't get a chance to talk to many of you after this, here's how you can get in touch with me. So I'm all over social media. It's probably not a good thing. But If you want to see some of my ranting and ravings, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Jemar Tisby. Also encourage you to visit two websites, thewitnessbcc.com and jemartisby.com. If you write about race and religion and culture, whatever your race or ethnicity, we encourage you to submit to The Witness. Go to the webpage, scroll all the way down to the bottom, click the link that says Write for Us, and you will see instructions there. I also have a lot more of my writing and materials on here. I want to emphasize this is the beginning of a conversation, the continuation of a conversation and not the end. And so following these resources is one way to keep that dialogue going. Also have two podcasts. One is called Pass the Mic and the other is called Footnotes. I know your professors would hate this, but if you feel the need to pull out your phone and subscribe right now, I wouldn't be mad. You can do that. Also want to say a little bit in thanks to Dr. Sandy Mayo. She is a treasure and a gift that you have on SPU's campus. Her vision, her leadership. And I know she's not alone. I just met one of my big modern day heroes, Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil. I had a wonderful time meeting with the team leading the John Perkins Center. And if you have not accessed the incredible resources there and the people there, please do so immediately. Immediately. So much good things, so much good stuff going on the campus here. And shout out to the students. I've had a chance to interact with some of you in a class this morning and at lunch this afternoon. I am really blown away by the caliber of thinking, and especially around topics of race and justice. You're eons beyond where I was as an undergrad. And a lot of people often ask me what encourages me in this work. It's you. It's the students. It's this generation coming up that cares and is willing to count the cost and put their lives, career, money, fortunes on the line for justice. So thank you for having me. One more note of housekeeping. We will have a brief time of Q&A afterwards. So text Ask Jemar and your message to 2233. I'll try to remind you again later, but as you're listening, feel free to ask questions about the presentation or about anything else that's going on. Why don't you advance it to the color of compromise is green. So let's begin. Number one, I come from a tradition where it's dialogical, and so you can talk back if you feel the need to say amen or clap or snap or amen or all right, whatever it might be. It's okay. It's okay. You can talk. But let's get down to business here. It's serious, sober business. The color of compromise is green. I want to start with this quote by James W.C. Pennington. So James W.C. Pennington was a minister and abolitionist in the 1800s, and he said this: the being of slavery, its soul and its body lives and moves in the chattel principle, the property principle, the bill of sale principle, and the cart whip, the starvation, the nakedness are all its inevitable consequences. See, a lot of people like to say that slavery was America's original sin. I think it might be more accurate to say that slavery was America's original symptom, and its original sin was greed. You see, to break it down quite simply, in a capitalist system, the goal is to maximize your profit and minimize your loss. If any of you have ever worked with or seen a budget, typically the greatest outlay financially is toward wages, labor, and benefits of your employees. And so, the best way to save money and increase profits is to reduce the wages that you give to your labor, or better yet, don't pay them at all. That is fundamentally what happened in race-based chattel slavery. It was at base an economically exploitative system that thrived off the unfree labor and bondage of black bodies. Beyond the barest essentials of food, clothing, and shelter, plantation owners didn't pay their workers. They forced them to labor almost constantly. Why? Because they were in pursuit of the almighty dollar. Now, this isn't to say that racism didn't exist before slavery, as we well know. You don't need any prodding or pushing to hate other people. That's in the human heart. But how did we come to have a society that was stratified along racial lines? How did it prove so enduring over decades and centuries and even affecting the church? One of the major reasons is money. This is why the Mississippi Articles of Secession said, our position, so this is the document that they wrote to explain why they were breaking off from the Union at the start of the Civil War and joining the Confederacy. January 1861, it said, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. So never let anyone tell you that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. It was fought over slavery because people who owned slaves and advocated for slavery understood the economic dimensions of it and that it was profitable, and that to take that away in their minds meant the crumbling of the economy and more specifically their own wealth and fortunes, or if you were poor and white, the possibility of wealth and fortune. It's the reason why they were willing to break off from the Union and send people to their death in a bloody civil war. Race-based chattel slavery turned a person into property. It attempted by the strange alchemy of the market to transform a human being into a commodity. And that's what chattel means. I often say not just slavery, but race-based chattel slavery. Chattel means property like real estate or a plow, except now it's applied to people. Next slide. The chattel principle turns people into property. So most slave ships were not originally designed to carry hundreds and hundreds of people. They had to be retrofitted for that. And when they redesigned these slave ships, do you think they did it with the comfort of the kidnapped passengers in mind? No. As they redesigned these slave ships to transport human beings, they did so the same way they would do with inanimate cargo, like gunpowder or lumber. And so they packed human beings in on top of one another. No personal space, no privacy, no comfort on a voyage that could last as long as 3 months. Next slide. This is a rendering of a man named Olaudah Equiano. He was an African kidnapped from Nigeria. He was of the Igbo tribe. He was about 11 when he was kidnapped, he along with his sister. And the most accurate reports we have of what slavery was actually like come from people like Equiano, who wrote in a genre called the slave narrative, and they wrote the true story about their experiences. And this is what he had to write on the separation from his sister. They were kidnapped together, but they were later separated, and this is what he said. The next day proved of greater sorrow than I had yet experienced, for my sister and I were then separated. While we lay clasped in each other's arms, it was in vain that we besought them not to part us. She was torn from me and immediately carried away, while I was left in a state of distraction, not to be described. I cried and grieved continually, and for several days I did not eat anything but what they forced into my mouth. And then Equiano turns his focus to Christians and the fact that many of these kidnappers and slave traders and slave owners called themselves Christian, and he said this: "O ye nominal Christians, might an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you?" He saw the hypocrisy. He said, how can you claim to love God but hate your neighbor in this way? One more quote from a historian says this: cynical though it may sound, it's not an exaggeration to submit that the critical fact in determining who opposed slavery and who supported it was a consequence entirely of political and economic factors. And he ends this way: all of the Christian conviction in the world could not dent the purse of one slaveholder. In the book, I write that the only other R word more controversial than racism is reparations. Now, look, we can debate exactly how reparations could be distributed, what's the best method to address the issue, who should get it and not. What should not be up for debate, however, is that for more than 2 centuries, enslaved black people built the wealth of this country without financial compensation. Even after the Civil War and emancipation, the dream of 40 acres and a mule never materialized. Black people emerged from one kind of slavery, but then they entered into another kind of slavery, the bondage of poverty. Today, student loan debt stands at $1.5 trillion, which is more than auto loans and more than credit card debt. But there's a disparate impact on black students who take on 85% more debt than white students, and they have to pay it back more slowly. They are specifically targeted in marketing by for-profit colleges. They also have a lack of family and generational wealth to draw on to pay for college. In a Pew Research study, it said that in 2013, white households had a median net worth that was 13 times that of black households. So in my view, you can't have a serious conversation about racial justice unless you also talk about money. You have to talk about economic justice. And guess what? Brothers and sisters who call on the name of Christ, we don't have to wait for the government to do it. If we as believers know a wrong has been committed, then why not lead the way instead of following the way? Why not initiate instead of oppose? The color of compromise is green. Next slide. The color of compromise is not only green, the color of compromise is white. Let's talk about the ideology. Next slide. So one of the themes in the book is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. Racism never goes away, it just adapts. Now there's a theological reason for this. We know that we're living in the time in between the times, between Jesus' first return and his second return. And until Jesus returns again, there's going to be sin and corruption in the world. But we as people who believe in God are the eruption of the kingdom into the world right now. And so we can be outposts and ambassadors of the kingdom, but we are always going to be surrounded by darkness and even darkness within, right? So we know racism is always going to be with us because we're always going to struggle with sin until Jesus returns. There's a theological backing for that. But there's also an ideological backing for that. Why does racism persist? It's because of white supremacy, which as my friend Daniel Hill, the author of White Awake, says, it's a narrative. It's a story we tell ourselves about race. I know that term, white supremacy, is jarring for people, but think of it as a story that we tell ourselves about race. It's a story that says the apex of society, or the center, you can think of a pyramid or you can think of concentric circles, the apex is white people. Everything and everyone else is other. That's why when I was in seminary, we studied theology until we studied black theology. Latin American theology. White, European, normal, central, everything else is different. Right? So we have this narrative of white supremacy that remains even though the manifestations of racism change. Next slide. In general, historically, you can think of 3 major phases of racial manifestations. The first is race-based chattel slavery. Following that is Jim Crow segregation in the form of legal and customs that separated people. And now we are living in what Emerson and Smith in their book, Divided by Faith, call a racialized society, where many of the factors, health, economics, education, still fall along racial lines, although the overt ways that happens are less visible for people who are unaware. And the simple fact is that symptoms of racial oppression can change and shift over time, but the narrative of racial difference remain, and the exact ways that racism rears its ugly head are different in 1619 or 1919 or 2019. But as long as this narrative of white supremacy or racial difference remains, we're always going to be dealing with different manifestations of racism. So we have to change the narrative. Next slide. So whiteness functions in a couple of ways. It does a few things. Number one, it obscures ethnicity. Number two, it creates this category called blackness. And number three, it maintains power through violence. I want to tackle just the first two, and I'll save the third for a different section. So number one, whiteness obscures identity. And by this, I mean for white people. So understand that if you are white or white presenting or white identifying, that this affects you negatively as well. So what white supremacy does is it says that, number one, what we have to understand is that whiteness has socially constructed meaning. All right, it's not based in biology. Right? The amount of melanin in your skin has nothing to do with your ontological value in God's eyes. And so it is a socially constructed category, but there's a trade-off. To become white, you must let go of your ethnicity and your nationality. So as a racialized system was being codified in the United States, what happened is people from Europe came over. And in exchange for becoming white and getting all the benefits of whiteness, you could no longer identify as strongly as being British or French or German. You had to give up your language, your customs, your tradition, your food, and aside from very small ethnic enclaves which still had the privileges of whiteness, because when you walk out the door and we see your phenotype, we treat you a certain way. You had to give that up. But here's the thing. When you embrace whiteness, you're automatically embracing anti-blackness, right? Whiteness can only exist in opposition and contradistinction to blackness, which is not an equal category. It's a lesser category in the terms of white supremacy. So the more you cling to your whiteness, the more you're clinging to this hierarchy or this marginalization of people of color. And that's the second thing that happens. So one of the action steps for white people is let go of your whiteness, embrace your ethnicity. Now, what a lot of people hear me saying is that if you're white, you're bad. No. What I'm saying is that the ideology of whiteness is sinful and evil and oppressive. And you can identify that because you're white, it has come with a certain history and context, and you can understand and communicate that, but you can also say there's more to me than that. You can recover the language, you can recover the food, you can recover the dress, you can recover an identity that goes beyond racism, right? But one of the other things that whiteness does, it creates this opposite category of black. The narrative of racial difference or white supremacy says that people of African descent have inherently less dignity, less worth, less ability, and less of everything than white people. We can look all the way back at the colonial era. There's a story of when Columbus is writing his diaries all the way back in the 1490s. He's identifying and describing people according to their appearance. Now, in one sense, that's natural. This is their first contact. But he's also saying that they're relegated to a certain place or hierarchy in society. He says they might easily be converted to Christianity, but even if not, they would make good servants. talking about Native Americans. Then you get stories like John Rolfe in Metawaka. You might know her as Pocahontas, but her other name was Rebecca. That was the English or proper name that she got when she was baptized. And they looked at this marriage between this white British man and this Native American woman and held it up as this great example of how you could civilize Native Americans. And part and parcel of that meant making them Christian. But not really making them Christian, making them a version of Christian that had everything to do with whiteness and white supremacy and cultural appropriation and assimilation. Right? In America, we have this thing called the one-drop rule. You are pure if it appears or you can prove that both your parents are white or white presenting. But the moment you have one drop of a person of color, you are considered a person of color. That's why Obama was the first black president, not the first white and black biracial president. According to the one drop rule, you are contaminated by any other person of color, any other race or ethnicity. What does this have to do with Christianity? Well, it's been in the news a lot lately, this idea of white nationalism. I think we need to add one more descriptor there, white Christian nationalism. What most people don't know about perhaps the most prominent expression of white Christian nationalism, the Ku Klux Klan, what most people don't know is that there were three major iterations of the Klan. The first came right after the Civil War to reinscribe white supremacy after emancipation. The last, or the other major one, came during the Civil Rights Movement to oppose the Black Freedom Movement. But the one in the middle is perhaps the most widespread and toxic form. It started in 1915. A group of white men led by a former Methodist circuit rider, meaning a former Methodist preacher, got together a group of his white buddies and they went to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia. Do you know what's on the front of Stone Mountain, Georgia? Davis, Lee, Forrest, Confederate leaders. And they went to the top of this mountain and they did a couple of things. Number one, they put up a cross and they burned it. They took this tradition from Scotch-Irish lore and they burned a cross. Then they built an altar. And on that altar, they put two items. They put the American flag and the Bible. The Bible was open to a passage in Romans chapter 12, that states, among other things, be devoted to one another in love. White Christian nationalism, this blending of a perverted form of patriotism and religion to say this is true Americanness. You are white Protestant Christian. And as long as that group of people is in charge, America's okay. But as soon as other people start getting more power or pushing back, we got a problem. The color of compromise is white. Next slide. But the color of compromise is also, so the color of compromise is also red. One of the things that we don't talk about enough in this conversation about race and racial justice and racism is violence. A moment ago, I mentioned two effects of white supremacy, that it erases ethnicity, that it creates this equal and opposite category of blackness. But there's one more effect of white supremacy. White supremacy says that in order to maintain power, in order to maintain control, violence is necessary. And physical violence has always been necessary in the maintenance of white supremacy. I like this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. He said this: "It's hard to face this, but all your phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. You see, what happens is that the image of God in people can be defaced, but it can never be erased. There's something in the spirit of human beings that says, I am somebody. And when they feel the burdens of oppression on them, as black people did through slavery and segregation and other forms of racism and marginalization, that spirit, which I think is the fingerprint of God upon each of us, wells up and says, I shouldn't be treated like this. I'm worthy of dignity. I'm worthy of respect. I'm just as good as you are. I'm just as human as you are. But when that spirit rears up in a white supremacist society, at some point, you're going to have to smash it down. And you're going to have to do so through force. And so I warn you, I have to talk about lynching now. And I do it not to be sensational or provocative in any way, but because this is part of our racial history as both a nation and a church. Next slide. So let me tell you about Luther and Mary Holbert. As with many of these things, we don't know all the exact details. What we do know is that it was 1904 in Sunflower County, Mississippi. There was a sort of a love triangle between two black male sharecroppers and a black woman. One of the black male sharecroppers was jealous, got into an altercation with the other black sharecropper. They couldn't resolve it, and so this jealous black sharecropper brings in the white plantation owner to arbitrate or settle the dispute. So the white plantation owner and the jealous black sharecropper go to this other black sharecropper's home. His name was Luther. And we don't know what words were spoken or who struck first. What we do know is that Luther, perhaps in an act of self-defense, killed both the black sharecropper and the white plantation owner. Now, if Luther had only killed the black sharecropper, well, he might have lost his job or been sent to jail. But since he killed a white man, and not just a white man, a rich white man, it was an automatic death sentence. So Luther finds Mary and they go on the run. They go on the run for 3 days. They hide in swamps, and Mary even dresses up like a man to disguise herself, but eventually the posse and the bloodhounds, they catch up to them. But the lynching didn't happen right away. They waited for a special day. They waited for Sunday, when the most people would be out of work and could come and witness this lynching. They also didn't do it in just any place. They strategically chose the location of this lynching for maximal terroristic fear. They did the lynching on the grounds of a black church. Why a black church? Because the black church has always been the ark of refuge for black people, a place where you could come and be affirmed in your identity as a child of God when people are calling you everything but. Where you can be called sir and ma'am and pastor and first lady and not boy or auntie or mammy. And so they did it on the grounds of a black church. And it wasn't quick either. They tortured them. First, they beat both Luther and Mary so severely that one of Luther's eyes hung out from its socket. Then they cut off each of the fingers and toes of Luther and Mary and gave them out as souvenirs. One of the odd things you think about when you study history is things like this. What happened to those fingers and toes? Are they in a jar somewhere in someone's attic? Did someone generations later look at it and say, what on earth is this, and just toss it? That wasn't the end of the torture. The Vicksburg Evening Post reported in an article at the time, it said the most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. This instrument was bored into the flesh of the man and woman in the arms, legs, and body, and then pulled out. The spirals tearing out big pieces of raw, quivering flesh every time it was withdrawn. And then finally, the Holberts, who were both still alive, were dragged to a fire and burned alive. They burned Mary first so that Luther could see his beloved killed in front of his remaining eye. And then they burned him. Did you know that throughout the Jim Crow era, an anti-lynching law was never passed at the federal level? That politicians at the time thought it was too risky to their re-election to simply state, hey, we shouldn't be killing people in vigilante murders outside of the law and due process, especially when it's race-based and especially when it's on trumped-up charges a lot of the times. The color of compromise is red. And so, at this point, it's a very depressing story. It's just the history. But so often, I think where we find ourselves is if we realize the weight of history and of Christian complicity in racism, then the next logical answer is ask, what do we do about it? Next logical question is, what do we do about it? Next slide. And so I write in the book that even though The Color of Compromise is a book about the past, it's really about the present and the future of the church. And there's this great phrase that Martin Luther King Jr. used in his I Have a Dream speech called the fierce urgency of now. And I'd like to play a clip where he uses that phrase.
We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual.
So that was 1963, more than half a century ago. And in a sense, we could still say that we need to respond to the fierce urgency of now when it comes to racial justice. And I love that phrase, fierce urgency of now, right? We know that urgent means immediate, but he says fierce. It grips you with an urgency that won't let you rest. And not just urgent, but now, not tomorrow, next week, right now, we need to make changes. And so what do you do? How do you do it? Next slide. In the book, in the last chapter, actually the whole book is a setup for you to get to the last chapter. I'm giving it away. Because I want you to feel the weight of history, and by the time you get to the end of the book, feel the fierce urgency of now. And be on the edge of your seat asking the question, what do we do? And so I propose in the book a model called the Arc of Racial Justice. I can't go into detail now, but you can ask me in the Q&A, but it briefly is an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. Now, this is not a linear process that you go through one stage and then another stage and then another stage. A lot of times these things are happening simultaneously, nor is it a process that has a definite endpoint. No matter how long you've been doing this work, there's more to learn. There's more awareness, there's more relationships, there's more commitment that you need to do. But I do think it gets at some of these different aspects of fighting for racial justice. So awareness means you gotta be put on game. Racial injustice has a playbook, and you need to know how racism functions. And there's a lot of ways you can add to your knowledge, whether reading books or watching documentaries or having conversations. But it's not just awareness, it's also relationships. One of the things that we believe as people of faith is that reconciliation is relational. That when God wanted to reconcile God's self to a people, he didn't send a text or a TikTok video. He sent a person. He sent Jesus, his very son, to build a relationship between us and God, but also between us and our neighbor. So we need relationships across racial and ethnic lines. And white people, this is going to be harder for you than for racial and ethnic minorities. You got to do it on purpose. You got to be intentional about it. But it's not just relationships. You see, especially in the white evangelical church, that's where they like to stop. Some of my best friends are black. We had a racial reconciliation service at church. But you know what? All the cups of coffee in the world aren't going to do a thing about mass incarceration. Aren't going to do a thing about criminal justice reform or education reform or the racial wealth gap. That's where commitment comes in, a commitment to action, a commitment to fighting racist policies that inscribe inequality into our social, economic, and even ecclesiastical landscape. So you need commitment. Next slide. But I'll tell you, this is the idea about racial policies. I think that's an area where we need to push on. From a quote from Ibram Kendi, any measure, a racist policy is any measure that produces or sustains racial inequality between racial groups. Next slide. But I don't think the fundamental problem we have with racial injustice today is a lack of tactics or strategies or practices. When it comes to fighting racial injustice, I don't think we have a how-to problem. I think we have a want-to problem. If I gave you 2 minutes to come up with a list of 3 to 5 or more anti-racist actions, I'll bet you could do it. I'll bet you could list the habits and the practices, the state of minds, or the policies that need to be changed in order to bring about a more racially equitable and just society. I bet you could do that. The question is, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we committing as individuals, as a nation, and as a church to decisive and fierce anti-racist action? That's not a question of how to, it's a question of want to. A lot of people say that if I was alive during the civil rights movement, I would have marched with Dr. King. I would have held the picket sign, I would have protested, I would have boycotted right along with them. Well, guess what, brothers and sisters? You're in the midst of another wave of the civil rights movement. You know it never really ended, don't you? And we're in the middle of another wave when voting rights are under attack, when we are locking up not only black men, but black women at unprecedented rates, when the racial wealth gap has reached and exceeded that of the 1920s before the Great Depression. We're dealing with an earth and a globe that's heating up, and it affects people of color differently, because you can look at Flint, Michigan and say that pollution is not equitably distributed across all communities. We are dealing with another wave of the civil rights movement. And if you say that you would have been part of the civil rights movement then I know the truth by what you're doing as part of the civil rights movement now. Don't pretend you would have been part of it half a century ago if you aren't part of it today. So brothers and sisters, as I close, I leave with the challenge. The question is not how to fight racism. The question is, will you fight racism? Thank you.
I'm just going to join Brother Jemar here and just communicate the questions that have come in. I'm going to get through as many as I can, but they were coming in faster than I can actually even read them, so
okay.
that's a good sign. But let's get started with the first one. A common discussion amongst friends is whether or not it is possible to be racist towards a white person. What is your stance?
So I like to often think about, pardon me, the question behind the question, right? And so a lot of times when people ask that question, and I'm not saying that this was this person, but a lot of times when people ask that question, they want to level accusations of reverse racism and use that essentially to say, well, black people are just as racist as white people. Why are you singling out white people? The problem with that is power. So in Beverly Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, I quote her in the introduction to the book as helping to define racism. And she basically defines it shorthand as prejudice plus power. And so anyone of any race or ethnicity can be prejudiced towards someone. You can dislike someone. There are certainly black people who just hate white folks. The difference is, in this country and context, we don't have, as black people, the institutional, social, economic, political power to enforce our prejudice and impose that prejudice on other people. That historically, in the US context, has been white people. Now, in other places and in other parts of the world, those dynamics are going to be different, but that group that has the power to impose their prejudice, it hits different. So, white people can create laws that say black people cannot sit at the lunch counter. Black people who hate white people have no such power. So one of the things is, I think that whole definition comes in terms of sort of refuting this idea of reverse racism. I think one of the fatal flaws in our understanding of racial dynamics today is this idea of false equivalency. That we see white people doing one thing and we see black people or people of color doing it and it's automatically the same. It ain't, because the power dynamic is different. And so, yeah, I mean, you can define racism in a lot of different ways, but that definition, that they're saying that black people and people of color can't be racist in a technical sense because we don't have the power to enforce our prejudice, that's all that's saying. It's not saying that people of color can't be hateful toward other people. It's that we can't craft a whole society based on that hatred because of power. Right.
So this one came in from several people. What are some practical steps we can take to work against our own complicity in racism?
That's great. That's great. Silence is violence. King said there comes a time when silence is betrayal. And so, especially for white people, you're in spaces that people of color will never be in. whether that's the fraternity or the dorm room or the dinner table. And you're going to be in situations, maybe even this coming week, when someone around you says something racist. They do a racism. And then it's going to be up to you to decide what to do. And I'll warn you in advance that if you haven't studied this stuff, you won't be ready in the moment. It's hard. Anti-racism has to become a reflex for all of us, so that in that moment, in that split second, when you have a moment to react, you know what to do. You know what to say because you've committed yourself to educating yourself. What we have to do, one of the things that we have to do is to interrupt race ignorance. Interrupt ignorance. All of us actually have that responsibility, but understand that people of color are interrupting ignorance just to survive on a daily basis. And one of the survival tactics for people of color is self-care. I know that's a buzzword now, but it's for real, for real. I don't know how many of you students are thinking about psychology or therapy, but we need you. We need people of color who can be counselors and therapists because we need mental health help. And it's often harder to do that across a racial divide with people who don't understand what it's like to maneuver in a white supremacist society and not be white. And so if you are white, you can, well, this gets into the arc of racial justice and the commitment. One of the commitments that we can change, can make to changing structures is helping to fund therapists and counselors to get their education, undergrad, masters, doctorates, open their own practices, et cetera, et cetera. But for people of color, self-care is vital. You don't always have to interrupt ignorance on someone else's schedule. You can say, not today. I love you, but I love me too. And I'm tired. Or I can't give you a good answer right now. That's okay.
Where do you see the chattel principle at work today?
The chattel principle at work today, it's at work in all kinds of ways. It's at work on the football field. Look, I went to Notre Dame. I live now in SEC country. Y'all have a pretty good football team up here. So you know, it's entertaining, but at the same time, you just listen to the ways that coaches, owners, sports analysts refer to athletes. One of the terms that's really jarring for me is when they say, they've got a stable of athletes. Like you would have a stable of animals, right? I was just in conversation today that if you are a black male on a predominantly white campus, oftentimes you get asked this question: what sport do you play? They even asked that to me, and I'm like, what? For real? Now, I was a boxer, so I got hands, but you wouldn't know that from looking at me. But that's one of the ways that we sort of commodify people, is to say that your presence here could only be as a commodity. You could only be an athlete. Here on scholarship, not on your intellectual merit, and here to entertain us or to make money for us. That's one way. Another way is in the prison system. I've spent several semesters having the honor really of being a teaching assistant in prisons in Mississippi, including Mississippi State Penitentiary, which is in the news right now because they've had 9 deaths over the past several months. Externally, they're attributing that to gang violence, but what they're not saying is that you've got corrupt security guards bringing in guns, bringing in cell phones, stoking violence. And honestly, we don't know for sure because they won't let people in. Mississippi State Penitentiary is also known as Parchman Farm. It was founded as a plantation in the early 1900s. And what would happen is they would get black people on trumped up charges like vagrancy laws. And they'd charge you with a fine, and if you didn't have enough money to pay the fine, then they would incarcerate you. And now that you were incarcerated, you were in the system, and they would sell your labor to other people, to coal mine owners, to other plantation owners in a system called convict leasing. And at Parchman Farm, they would literally have inmates in the 1900s picking cotton with white officers on horseback with shotguns and sometimes even a whip. More than half a century after the Civil War, commodification of people continues in all kinds of ways.
As a seminary graduate and theology student yourself, where have you seen and where do you see whiteness play out in theological education?
All over the place. So as I mentioned before, it's just theology until you study the theology that arises from marginalized and oppressed communities, typically communities of color. So when I was in seminary, which wasn't that long ago, we never really heard about Black liberation theology, or in particular James Cone, except to say this is what not to do. It wasn't in an in-depth dialogue about the merits or the approach of this particular theological system. It was to compare it to another theological system which just so happened was devised by European white men, and say that this is the standard and all this other stuff is somehow lesser, inferior, heretical. So that's one of the ways it shows up. Another way, I spoke in a class this morning, I said theology needs history, because all theology arises out of a context. And history tells you that context socially, politically, culturally, economically, to say that there's no purely objective way of reading the Bible, but it comes from people who are in a particular social location. And if all we're doing is learning theology and the Bible from people who are in that particular social location, then what are we saying about the image of God, the dignity, intelligence, the theologizing of people of color and the poor? And so that came through in all kinds of ways. It's coming through now in that for some people, GOP doesn't stand for Grand Old Party, it stands for God's Own Party. And that the only way to be a Christian in good conscience is to vote for the modern day Republican Party, which, you know, black voters might have something to say about, and lots of other people of color. So it's still showing up in all kinds of ways. And I think in particular, our curricula, I had to both undergrad and in seminary have the curriculum they gave me and the curriculum I created. Because if I was going to minister to and serve and speak to non-white audiences, I had to collect those materials myself. And you may still have to do that in some circumstances. Yeah.
How do we find a way to dispel the narrative for poor rural white people that any gains for black folks comes at the expense of them?
That's great. Yeah, so it might surprise you to know that people act against their own interests. And throughout U.S. history, movements, social movements that had poor black and poor white people and other poor people of color were the most potent movements. But they're very short-lived because people who have power and money want to break those coalitions up really, really quickly. That's what King was on the cusp of before he was assassinated, the Poor People's Campaign. They were asking questions about the Poor People's Campaign. They were like, should we reach out to poor white people? And King said, yes, absolutely. We need this fusion coalition of people to come together across racial and ethnic lines in solidarity with one another and demand for more equitable distribution of goods and privileges and economic wealth. But those are always short-lived, and there's something called the wages of whiteness. So that currency is not just financial currency, there's also cultural currency. And what a lot of poor white people believe is that the cultural currency of being white is more valuable than that financial currency. Or they don't see how embracing that cultural currency of whiteness is actually hurting their financial fortunes as well. It's very difficult to sort of get through that because the voices a lot of people trust are reinforcing these ideas of division and separation. There's a historian named Carrie Lee Merritt who has done a great job studying poor white people, particularly in the post-Civil War South, but has application broadly. There's a whole field now called whiteness studies that talks about what beliefs that whiteness as an ideology inculcates in people, and what to do about it. So there are other experts, is what I'm saying.
I think this is going to be our last question. What are the financial obligations of the church in this context?
My. So the financial obligations are many. Have a good night. What I think is incumbent upon the church and other Christian institutions is an interrogation of their past when it comes specifically to race. So I talked about this in class earlier. Princeton Theological Seminary has committed over $20 million in reparations because they found, by going through their history, that they had benefited from the wages of slavery. And in recompense, they're setting aside an endowment that will help establish a new department and program focused on African American ministry and theology, and also tuition alleviation. The students at Georgetown themselves voted to increase their own tuition, to offer free tuition to the descendants of enslaved people who were sold to help keep Georgetown afloat. So institutions have to interrogate their own past, and when you do that, you start to see your institutional complicity with racism, and then you can have the conversation about what is owed. But the obstacle and the impediment so often to any idea of financial redistribution is there's a cadre of people, usually the ones who have the money or decision-making power, that refuse to admit that an injustice has been done. And until you admit an injustice has been done, you can't get anywhere talking about what to do about it. And so that's the conversation that advocates and allies and racial justice warriors need to be having, is to point out, mainly through the study of history, but all kinds of ways, that an injustice has been committed. And then leave it in their lap. What are you going to do about it? That's the fierce urgency of now. See, it would have been a lot easier to deal with the financial repercussions of slavery in 1866. But nobody wanted to do it then. They didn't want to do it in 1906 or 1956 or 2006. And so the question is, when is the generation of Christians going to rise up and say, okay, let's at least put this issue on the table and try to deal with it decisively? So we don't have to wait for the world to get on board. As King said, we can be the headlight and not the tail light. We can be the temperature gauge, the thermostat, and turn up the temperature on this, and not just tell people what the temperature is. So it is incumbent upon us, and I think we do have a big obligation, and depending on your institution, it might look different. I didn't say it. That's good. Thank you. Great. Thank you. All right.
Thanks again for coming this evening, for supporting our first lecture. Please look out for next year's event and future events. We'd love to have this kind of engagement with our broader community. And so we're just truly grateful for your time this evening. Thank you.